So there's a part of this Iran strike story that didn't make the headlines, and I want to walk you through it. Because how the Prime Minister of Israel found out the attack was canceled, that's where the whole thing breaks open. Quick thing before we get into it. Drop the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to know where everyone's tuning in today. I actually do read them. So let's just start with the headline, because it's almost too wild to be real. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, Israel Katz, they learned that the United States had canceled a planned joint strike on Iran from Donald Trump's Truth Social account. They were in the dark for hours. Hours. While the world's most powerful military made a decision that could have started a regional war, Israel's top leadership was scrolling social media like the rest of us, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Now ask yourself, how does that happen? How does the United States' closest ally in the Middle East get treated like a random follower refreshing a feed? I spent the morning going back through exactly what went down in Washington and Tel Aviv yesterday. And the more I read, the clearer it got that this wasn't a glitch. This was a message. So here's what we know. The strike was supposed to happen on August 1st, a joint U.S.-Israel operation. And not some small thing either. Trump himself had posted days earlier that if they hit Iran, it would be at levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II. That's not subtle. That's not a warning shot. That's saber rattling at nuclear scale. And Israel was all in. They'd been gearing up for this. Military resources concentrated, troops on standby, the whole apparatus ready to go. And then silence. Hours pass. No word from Washington. No call from the Pentagon. No secure line update from the White House. Just a void. Israeli officials were literally refreshing their phones, trying to figure out if they were about to go to war or stand down. One senior official told Israeli media, quote, "Trump left us in the dark." Now think about what that means. We're not talking about some low-level diplomatic spat. We're talking about a joint military operation, coordinated, planned, ready to launch. And America's commander-in-chief decides to cancel it and doesn't bother to call his supposed ally? At first, Israeli officials had a theory. They thought maybe Trump was doing it on purpose. A psychological op. Announce publicly that you're canceling, make Iran drop its guard, then hit him anyway. Classic military deception. So they waited, watched, held their breath, but then they made contact with U.S. officials and got the confirmation nobody expected. It was real. The strike was off. No trick, no double bluff. Just a cancellation. Posted online like a restaurant changing its hours. And that's when the frustration really hit. Another Israeli official spoke to Channel 12 and said, and I quote, "This is frustrating. We don't understand what the U.S. president's ultimate goal is. Don't understand. That's the phrase. The defense minister of Israel doesn't understand what the American president is doing. And if you're watching this and thinking, okay, so what? Sometimes allies disagree, then you're missing the real shockwave here. Because this isn't just a breakdown in communication. This is a breakdown in trust. And once that goes, it's almost impossible to get back. But I got to pause here for a second and give you some context, because this didn't come out of nowhere. This has been building for months, maybe years. There's a pattern here that every network is glossing over, and I want you to understand it. Let's go back a little. The U.S.-Israel relationship has always had its tensions. That's not new. Every president has had moments where they pulled the leash a little. But what we're seeing now, this is different. This is complete information blackout. This is making a decision that affects Israel's national security and letting them find out through a social media post. One Israeli official called it being left in a fog. Another said they felt like they'd been abandoned by their ally. Now, here's what's really interesting. Israeli officials told their media that they still don't trust this decision is permanent. They think Trump could change his mind again at any moment. So even though the strike is supposedly off, the Israeli military is staying at high alert. Think about what that means. The economic cost, the exhaustion, the burnout on troops, keeping an entire military apparatus at combat readiness for an attack that might never come, that your ally might cancel on a whim again. That's not just frustrating, that's debilitating. That's the kind of thing that destroys an alliance from the inside out. And look, I want to be really clear about something. Iran is denying they asked for a pause. Iranian military sources called Trump's claim a new lie and said their forces remain at the highest state of readiness. So you've got one side saying, I canceled because they asked me to, and the other side saying, that's a lie. We never asked for anything. In the middle of that mess is Israel. Now, as the hours went on, a clearer picture of what actually happened started to emerge. And I want to walk you through the timeline because it's crazier than you think. Trump's Truth Social post went up, and in it he said Iran and other Middle Eastern countries had asked him to hold off on the strikes because they were close to a deal. He made it sound like a diplomatic victory. But here's what he didn't say. He didn't mention Israel. He didn't say, I consulted with my allies. He didn't say, I notified them first. He just posted it, like a tweet. And the Prime Minister of Israel learned about it the same way you or I did. Now, there's another layer here that I haven't seen anyone really dig into. Israeli officials initially suspected the announcement was a tactic to lower Iran's guard. That tells you something really important. They don't trust the information they're getting from the United States. They automatically assumed Trump was lying to the public for strategic reasons. That's how broken the communication has become. And then, after they confirmed it was real, they were told the U.S. would be negotiating with Iran on August 3rd, a day later. So let me ask you something. If you're the Prime Minister of Israel and your ally has just canceled a joint military operation, and that same ally is now going to negotiate with your mortal enemy less than 48 hours later, how do you feel? You feel played. You feel irrelevant. You feel like the alliance you've staked your country's security on is suddenly not what you thought it was. And that's exactly what Israeli media is reporting. Officials are saying they felt abandoned. They felt like the U.S. was making decisions that affect Israel's survival without even checking in. One official said, and I'm quoting directly, "Trump left us in the dark." That's not diplomatic language. That's not careful, measured criticism. That's a stab of betrayal being spoken out loud. Now I want to bring in something a military analyst said that I think is critical here. There's a Chinese military commentator named Du Wenlong who has been following this, and he pointed something out that I haven't heard anyone on American TV say. He said the cancellation was a reluctant move on Trump's part. Why? 3 reasons. 1, American military hardware consumption is already over 50%. They don't have the stockpiles to sustain a major war right now. 2, the conflict has been hurting Trump's domestic approval ratings. 3, the money. They've already burned through massive amounts of funding. Another major strike would require billions more. So let me ask you again. If the U.S. military is depleted, if the president's approval is hurting, and if the money is running out, what is the strategy here? Is Trump canceling the strike because he's actually committed to diplomacy? Or is he canceling because he can't afford to follow through? And if it's the second one, what does that mean for Israel? What does that mean for every ally watching this unfold? Because here's the thing about power. When you project strength, you have to be able to back it up. When you make threats and then walk them back publicly with no real strategy for what comes next, you're not demonstrating strength. You're demonstrating uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads. It's infectious. Iran sees that America blinked. They're not going to be more cooperative now. They're going to be more emboldened. They already denied they asked for a pause. They're already talking about how the Strait of Hormuz situation is permanent. And Israel? Israel sees that when it matters most, they can't count on Washington to stand with them. Now, here's where I want to slow down and really look at what this means for the alliance itself. An expert at the China Institute of International Studies pointed out something I think is worth chewing on. They said that Trump's temporary pullback was a reluctant move, primarily to protect U.S. interests in the Middle East and the economic security of Gulf allies. Notice what's missing from that list. Israel isn't on it. The focus is on protecting American interests, satisfying Gulf states who were worried about escalation, and preventing a wider war that the U.S. can't sustain. Israel's security concerns, they were treated as secondary. And that's the real story here. That's the thing nobody's saying out loud. Israel's ability to influence U.S. decision-making is shrinking. The expert said, and I'm paraphrasing, that while Israel remains the U.S.'s first priority for operational coordination, its strategic voice is being marginalized. They're still useful for intelligence and military cooperation, but when the big decisions get made, they're not in the room. And that's a fundamental shift. Now, let me tell you what I think happens next, because this isn't over. It's not even close to over. Trump is still talking about hitting Iran. He's still threatening that if the Strait of Hormuz isn't reopened soon, Iran will be hit very hard. He's keeping that option on the table. Israel is still at high alert. They're not standing down. They're waiting for the rug to get pulled out from under them again. And Iran? They're in a stronger position than they were last week. They called Trump's bluff. They denied his claim. They showed the world that when it came down to it, the U.S. blinked. So what happens next time? What happens when the U.S. makes another threat and Israel has to decide whether to commit resources? What happens when American credibility is damaged and allies start wondering, is the U.S. going to be there when we need them? There's a pattern here I think we should pay attention to. Israel's military has been fighting multi-front conflicts for nearly 3 years. They're exhausted. They're stretched thin. And an Israeli strategic expert said that they can no longer bear a full-scale conflict with Iran alone. That's the key line. Can't bear it alone. So if they can't do it alone, and they can't trust the United States to back them up, what do? One thing being reported is that Israel is developing a 10-year plan to reduce its dependence on American military aid and technology. They're looking at a future where they don't rely on the United States for defense. That's huge. That's not a decision you make lightly. That's a fundamental reorientation of their national security posture. And it's happening right now in real time because of what happened this week. Now let me bring this back to you, because I think there's something in this whole situation that we should be paying attention to. The way the United States treats its allies matters, not just to the allies themselves, but to the whole world. When America's closest partner in the Middle East finds out about a canceled war through social media, what does that tell every other country that depends on U.S. security guarantees? It tells them that they can't be sure the U.S. will keep its word. And in international relations, that's a death sentence for alliances. Japan is watching. South Korea is watching. NATO is watching. Every country that has a U.S. security commitment is watching how Israel got treated. And they're asking themselves, is that what happens to us? That's not a comfortable question for anyone in Washington to answer right now. I'd been doing this for a while. I've covered a lot of crises. I've watched alliances bend and sometimes break. But I've never seen anything quite like this. The Prime Minister of Israel scrolling through Truth Social to find out if his country is going to war. That's not a glitch. That's a choice. And choices have consequences. Now, here's where I want to land on this, because I think you came to this video looking for something real, something that cuts through the noise. And I'm going to give that to you. Spirit, what happened this week isn't just about a canceled strike. It's about something bigger. It's about the collapse of trust between allies. It's about the unwillingness to communicate when it matters most. It's about treating a strategic partner like they're just another follower on a social media feed. And here's what I want you to hold on to. When your allies don't trust you, they start making their own plans. They stop sharing intelligence. They stop coordinating. They start looking for other options. And in a region as volatile as the Middle East, that's a recipe for miscalculation. What happens if Israel decides not to wait next time? What happens if they launch a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities without consulting Washington, because they don't trust they'll get a straight answer? That's not a hypothetical. That's a real scenario. And it's more likely today than it was a week ago. Now I want to close with something that's been sticking with me since I read this whole thing. One Israeli official said this: "We don't understand what the U.S. president's ultimate goal is." Think about that. The person in charge of defending a country doesn't understand the strategy of their most important ally. That's a failure of communication. That's a failure of leadership. And in the end, when the next crisis comes, and it will come, that failure is going to have consequences for Israel, for America, for everyone caught in the middle. So I'll leave you with this question, one I've been asking myself all week. If the United States can't be trusted to communicate with its closest allies, who can it be trusted to communicate with? You can roll your eyes and say it's just politics, but the world is watching. The world is learning. And the world is taking notes about who keeps its promises. This isn't over. It's really just beginning. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me through this one. I know it's a lot to take in. If you want to stay updated on this, there's a subscribe button somewhere on this page. Hit it if you want to keep getting these breakdowns. I'll keep doing the reading so you don't have to. Take care of yourselves, and don't forget to drop your country in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you're watching from. See you in the next one.